Okay, I've tried to set this up so that you can still see with the little video in the side, so hopefully that's worked there. Okay, so hello and thank you for coming along to my session. As Donna said, I am Natalie Jester and I'm based in the School of Sociology, Politics and International Studies at University of Bristol. And today I will be talking about asynchronous teaching methods. I've come to this through a bit of an unusual way in that I am not currently the unit owner of the units that I teach on. I'm a seminar tutor, and so a lot of what I've learned has been sort of based around how to fit in with other people's units. So that will have affected what I've learned so far. But if you have any questions about sort of your own units, I'd be more than happy to answer those as well. So the structure of the session today will be firstly what is asynchronous teaching, and should it be considered a replacement for synchronous teaching or a supplement? We'll then have a bit of a think about the accessibility concerns within asynchronous teaching. There's quite a lot to say here. Hopefully, like me, you think that it's on topic. Yeah, there's a lot to think about there. And then finally, the largest part of this bit that I'm delivering here relates to some methods for teaching asynchronously, because I think that one of the things that I've been struggling with is the methods of online teaching in terms of the resources that I found online. So I thought that I would finish with that. Firstly then, what is asynchronous learning and teaching? Well, I think it's perhaps helpful to think first about what synchronous teaching is. Synchronous teaching is teaching that happens at the same time. So usually this will be in a classroom where everyone is sat together in the same physical space. Asynchronous teaching and learning, however, is teaching and learning that happens at different times. So this is essentially where students can work at their own convenience. It can all be done at different times and no one has to be in the same place. So I would like to know what you think some of the benefits of asynchronous teaching might be. Can anybody share some of the benefits of asynchronous teaching? Okay. Brilliant. So I will just come on to the next part now. So when we're thinking about asynchronous teaching, I think that it's helpful to start by considering whether or not this should be a replacement for synchronous teaching, or whether we might want to use it as a supplement instead. We don't know what's going to happen next year. I'm sure that you've all been party to lots of different discussions about what our teaching offer will look like in different universities. And I think there are some places that are suggesting that some of it will be online, some of it saying it might all be online. There's some discussion about the role of face-to-face teaching at the moment. We don't really know what's going to happen. And so one of my arguments here is that it's helpful to consider asynchronous teaching early at this point, to think about what we might do based on different scenarios that we might think about over the summer. So what happens if you're suddenly told to take everything online? It's good to be thinking about that sort of thing now. When you're thinking about this question, it really does depend exactly what you're needing to do with your teaching. So for instance, one of my colleagues runs lots of simulations with her students. So things like the United Nations, or thinking about a vote in the US Congress. And when she's doing these activities, it's much easier and there's a nice sense of sort of team building if you can do that in person, synchronously at the same time. So it might be the case that for those particular activities that she's doing, that it wouldn't necessarily be appropriate to have asynchronous teaching as a replacement for that. but it might be the case that she might use some other things to supplement that particular exercise. So it really does depend exactly what you need to do. It also depends on what systems you have in place at your university as well, and how much what the capacity is of those various systems. So, for instance, with respect to synchronous classes, you need to buy a particular license if you want to run Zoom meetings over a long period of time. So it's about thinking about what you need to do and what you have available to you. I also think that it's important to consider that asynchronous methods can supplement face-to-face teaching as well. So we don't have to think of this as an either-or thing. And it might be the case that if things do eventually go back to normal, that we might incorporate some asynchronous methods for reasons that I will talk to you about in a second. So I think one of the main reasons for me for incorporating asynchronous teaching in our methods is that it offers us a huge amount with respect to accessibility. If we're thinking about people who might not be mobile, people who might struggle to come into university, for example, it offers us an opportunity to support those students by delivering asynchronous online teaching. It helps them to engage a bit more. So I think there are lots of benefits with respect to asynchronous teaching. My work on this is informed by Selwyn's concept of digital inequalities, and hopefully someone will be sharing the link with you in the chat there. Selwyn talks about the fact that when we're thinking about the digital realm, we often assume that that it's all completely level now, that everyone has the same access, the same ability to engage, but that isn't really the case. And so it's important to think about accessibility when we're thinking about our asynchronous teaching. And specifically how our individual students are affected. Our students will be quite diverse between institutions, between different programs, perhaps even within the same program, but within different units. You might have a different sort of student on there. So it's really, really important to think about how your students are affected and how asynchronous teaching might be helpful for them. So I'd just like to give you a minute or two to type in the chat box some accessibility issues that you might come up against within online teaching. Perhaps you might also share whether you think that asynchronous teaching could help with any of those. So I'll just give you 30 seconds to a minute to type in the box there. Okay, so here are some of the accessibility concerns that I've thought of when we're thinking about online teaching, and especially the issues with synchronous and asynchronous teaching. I won't read all of these out to you now because there are quite a few concerns that I've thought of there. Broadly though, I would say that these are grouped into social, spatial and health related concerns. And I think that it's important to consider exactly what issues your students might have with respect to online teaching. So, the largest part then of my presentation considers some of the different methods that you might use for teaching asynchronously online. There are lots of different methods that you might use, but I'm going to just show you three. I've picked these three because I think that they are perhaps the easiest to engage with, using resources that you might already have access to. But these are by no means the only ones, and I would be really keen to think a little bit about what other ones you might use when we're having the discussion afterwards. So firstly then, I really like using Google Docs for the asynchronous elements of my teaching. Google Docs are essentially an online version of Microsoft Word. You can, use all of the same functions of Word. But the great thing about this is that students can fill these in. So I put my handouts on Google Docs, and I will show you an example in a second. I put my handouts on Google Docs, and students can fill these in, and then you can leave comments for them on the material that they've filled out. So I think it's important just to stress here that asynchronous teaching does require engagement of different varieties, and I think that this is a nice way of engaging with students who might not be able to attend Zoom classes, for instance. So that's what I've been offering for my students who haven't been able to participate via Zoom. They can use this as a low bandwidth option if they're struggling to get an internet connection, and they can fill it out at their convenience. They don't have to do it all in one go. And then we can have a dialogue over the comments. So hopefully you can see there. Move that up. So here's an example of one of my handouts here for the week on democracy and nation. You can see there that I've got some questions in there for them, some definitions that I want them to fill out. So the students can type in their answers there, and then on the side I can offer comments to them around what they've said, and they can reply to my comments, they can ask me questions over the comments, and it's really, really easy to use. All you have to do is get your students to copy your handouts to their own Google Doc, and then they can send you a link to that, and you can both comment on that, provided they have opened the permissions. Okay. However, I think the element that I'm most familiar with here is the online resource repositories. I'm a big fan of these because they are a really good stretch activity for students who want to do more. So again, I'll show you an example in a second, but if your students are the kind of people who will do all of their reading, and they'll come to class and they'll ask you questions and they want to do extra afterwards, you can send them to your resource repository and they can have a look at all of your extra resources on there. Donna mentioned at the start that there are lots of advantages, hopefully, to online teaching. And I think that online resource repositories are a really good example of that, because you can provide your students with lots of different media you might not traditionally use in your classroom. I do use popular culture in my classroom through videos and such like, but if you're using an online resource repository, you can have a whole variety of things on there, and you can have lots of things on there. It might be podcasts, it might be links to news articles, links to further reading, all sorts of material there. It's also free to use websites like Blogger or WordPress. I really like Blogger because I find it to be very simple to use. It's essentially a lot like a Word document, and again, I'll show you an example in a second. I would also suggest, however, that you make use of an accessibility checker if you are going to make yourself an online resource repository. This one is quite helpful, the one that I've got there, and hopefully someone will be sharing a link to that in the chat. It's really important to make sure that we are making our online teaching work for all of our students and not accidentally shutting any of them out. So for instance, if you post lots of images on your online resource repositories, it might be the case that people with a screen reader struggle to see those. So you need to have a bit of a think about exactly what's going to go in there. I'll just show you this one now. Okay, so this is my resource repository that I made. As I said at the start, I am not the unit owner for the classes that I teach. I'm a seminar tutor, but I was allowed to make this for my students. I did it via Blogger, and there's lots of resources on there. It's really easy to use, and hopefully someone will be sharing a link to that in the chat now. I also think that you can get quite a nice design on Blogger without really much effort at all. So you can just select one of the pre-designed templates and add the pages that you want and then go. I'm just giving you an example here of one of the behind the scenes pages, I suppose. So you can see here, it's essentially a lot like Word. All you have to do is type in the text that you want. There's a facility on there to add a link that you should hopefully be able to see. You can change the font size, you can change the font, you can underline things, bold things, you can add headings, all of these things. There's lots of different things that you can do on the Blogger site, and it's really, really easy to use, I promise. So I very much recommend using Blogger for your online resource repository. The last resource that I would like to share with you is online message boards. Online message boards are really, really great for larger asynchronous discussion. So a couple of minutes ago, I mentioned how I have used Google Docs to have asynchronous discussion one-on-one with my students, perhaps the ones that can't come to Zoom classes. But it does get a bit unwieldy if you want to do that for lots of people. It's okay if you've got a class of only 10 or so, but I can't imagine many of us do. So it might be the case actually that online message boards are a better way of running asynchronous discussion. Again, I'll show you an example in a minute, but you can set these up across a whole variety of platforms. We have Blackboard at my institution, but I do believe that you can set these up through the platforms that other institutions have as well. There are lots of different ways of structuring your online message board. You can set these up per class or per cohort. So it might be the case that I set mine up for my classes of around 15 people. Or alternatively, I might set one up for all of my classes, so around 70 people. They offer different things, I think. So if you want to set one up per class, it does mean that people will be interacting with the same people each week, that they can get to know everyone a little bit better. It might be good for team building. I know that Christina talked a little bit about the need to build community last week, and so it might be good to build these message boards around each class. However, there is something to be said for building them per cohort, in that you will need to engage with the students on these platforms, and a larger cohort of people makes it easier for the discussion to keep going, so you don't have to step in quite so much if you offer the message board as a whole cohort thing. You can set different discussion questions each week, so it might be the case that you take across the questions that you have set up for your existing face-to-face seminars and just transfer those to the message boards. So for my classes each week, I have my handouts, but I have sort of 3 overarching questions that I want my students to answer. So it might be the case that if I were doing a message board, I would start by posing those 3 questions, and then as the discussion goes on, I can interject with other elements from my handouts if they don't come up naturally in conversation. The other way of doing this is to ask students to set their own questions in advance. So you're turning this around and asking them to think a little bit more about how they would like to engage with these different topics. and then you can add those each week, so you can build that into your assessment, I suppose. The other option is to let your students post whatever they like with you moderating. There is a little bit of a risk with that they choose not to post anything, or that they might potentially post something inappropriate. So again, I would like to reiterate that you will need to engage with them when you are using this particular method. So I'll just show you an example, show you what that could look like. I've just blurred out the authors there. I've taken the first couple of posts from one of the message boards for one of the units that I teach on there. This is the one where students could ask their own questions. So what we did for this particular message board was to have one board set up where we asked them questions each week, and another board set up where they could ask their own questions. And one of the interesting things to come out of these questions is that a lot of them were around assessment. So it was about showing us the things that perhaps we hadn't made as clear as we could have done. And doing it this way, doing it publicly, means that students can just look at the questions that other people are asking. They don't all need to be sending you emails about the same subject. Okay. So, how do you know whether you should use asynchronous methods in your teaching? Well, for me, this whole discussion sort of started in my mind when we moved online very, very suddenly, and I realised that I didn't know exactly what situation my students were in. Obviously, I know them very well, but everything changed very quickly, and I wanted to feel a little bit more confident in making sure that I was making the right decisions. And so what I decided to do was to survey my students. I've never done this before, but it occurred to me that it will be a helpful thing to do in this case, because everything was so different. Hopefully the link to my example survey is being shared in the chat there for you. So just a couple of screenshots for you there. The online learning survey that I set up for my students, I will admit that I spent quite a while thinking about what questions to ask them. But once I'd done that, it was really, really easy on Google Forms. It took me about 5 minutes to set it up. With respect to each of the questions, you can set different answer types. So you can see on the screenshot there, there's an option for short answer text, for long answer text. You can see on the other screenshot that there's also an option for, you just tick one box and it comes back as a nice little pie chart in the results there. So there's lots of different ways that you can set up your survey. And I think that it's a really, really valuable way of understanding what your students need. And it was the thing that really cemented to me the need for asynchronous teaching, at least to some degree, because some of my students were not really able to access the internet with ease. Several of them were in different time zones, for instance. I knew that that would probably be the case, but it occurred to me only at this point that I didn't know exactly when those time zones were, how far ahead or behind they were. So this survey was really, really helpful for me in helping me decide that I needed to use asynchronous methods. And I think that it would be really helpful for each of us to survey our students in some way. I'm not exactly sure what that will look like for each of you. It might be the case that you do it at departmental level, because everyone will be going into new classes at the start of the year. So there's lots of different ways of doing that, and I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A. So some key takeaways from this, that it's really helpful to ask your students exactly what they need. And it might be the case that it persuades you that you need some asynchronous teaching, or that all of it has to be asynchronous. If they all have bad internet connections, for example, you probably will need to do some asynchronous teaching. Again, this is where the survey comes in, but try and anticipate your student accessibility needs in advance of class. It will make your life a lot easier. And again, asynchronous teaching is really good for that. And just as a sort of wider principle for all of this, to share your ideas and your problems and your resources with other people, like through these webinars that the PSA has been offering. There's no point in reinventing the wheel. There are loads of really great resources out there. I'm happy for all of you to take all of the resources that I've given you there, to use templates, all of that. Share your ideas, and hopefully things will be good at the start of the next term. We'll feel quite well prepared for that. So that is the end of my presentation. I will just stop sharing there. In the last one of these, we had lots of great comments and questions in the Q&A. So does anybody have any comments or questions?
Yeah, Natalie, we've had quite a few comments and questions coming through. That was a great presentation, thanks. And it's you've really got a range of thoughts coming from colleagues. The first one, I think early on you skipped over a slide about student accessibility. Just want to go back and tell us a little bit more about that in a bit more detail, because I think that was something that a lot of colleagues were interested in.
Yeah, sure. So the easiest way of doing that is probably to share my screen again.
Yeah.
Bear with me a second. So the reason I skipped over this a little bit is because I know that the topic of today is asynchronous teaching and not accessibility, but I am that person who will always bring up accessibility. And I was hoping that you would ask me a little bit more about that. So the things on this slide are a mixture of potential issues that I had anticipated and things from the surveys that my students have filled in. I didn't want to share exactly what they've typed in for this for privacy reasons, so I've sort of condensed it here. I am teaching around 70 students this term, so this is from a fair amount of people. I'll be honest, there are some issues here that I hadn't fully anticipated. So the issue with the internet was something that I thought might be a problem, but it ended up being a little bit more of a problem than I thought it would be. You might think about this if your students are currently based in other countries, but I would also like to remind you that large parts of the UK have very poor internet as well. And a fair number of my students, particularly the ones living in rural locations, struggle to get a good connection. And so that's what led to me thinking that I needed to design the Google Docs format for those students to ensure that they weren't missing out because they had a poor internet connection. It might also be the case that your students struggle to afford the internet, and if that's the case, it's going to be really, really difficult for them to participate in Zoom conversations because it eats up so much of your data allowance. So asynchronous teaching is a really good way of mitigating that as an issue because it is typically much lower bandwidth. There's also a whole other host of issues that I think COVID-19 has brought up. Your students might have it. Some of my students have had COVID-19. I didn't want them to miss out on any element of my teaching. So whilst I offered my typical seminars over Zoom, I also wanted to have different options in place in case they were sick, in case they had to leave the class halfway through, to make sure that they didn't miss out on anything. It's also aggravated a whole load of other issues that have always been a problem but are exaggerated at the moment. So things like caring responsibilities, other disabilities that might be aggravated by stress, for instance. It's thrown up a whole a whole new dimension to existing inequalities. So I think that it's really, really important that we think about those as well. I will stop sharing my screen there.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Natalie. We had a question about how had you used student feedback to shape your approach, which we was asked just literally before you then talked about student feedback, and how you'd gained it, and I think that was really interesting. But one question that came through, I suppose it's always a problem, isn't it, in terms of when you ask for feedback. One is getting the questions right to get the feedback, but the other one is the question of, do the students necessarily have the information and the knowledge they need to give effective feedback? And I wondered whether there were any issues there that kind of students flagged or didn't flag that kind of came out as key issues that you needed to look at and work through.
I think it's important to return to the fact that we are very much doing emergency online teaching at the moment. And while certain institutions, the OU being one of them, are experts in this, at the moment it has been a bit of a rush. And so I think that we are all sort of doing our best to think about these things as the issues come up. My students didn't flag any particular issues in the feedback that I asked them to provide. I know not all institutions are currently asking for student feedback, and it also seems to vary between departments. So again, it might also be helpful to use Google Forms for that as well. But my students didn't have any particular issues with what I'd done this term. And I think that it will help to spend some time over the summer talking generally to students, talking to our colleagues to think about this in more detail, ready for the new term. And hopefully by then students will have also had a chance to digest what has happened this term, and they can tell us whether there's anything that they wanted to share that they forgot to share at the end of last term. So essentially it's a strange time, and I think that it will be, students will find it easier to think about the questions and comments that they have around our delivery when we've started the next term.